Sometimes the loneliest hearts find each other in the most unexpected places. In a world where worth is measured by strength and status, true connection blooms from simple acts of kindness. In ancient Norway, while the village of Skarnvik feasted and celebrated their latest victory, a nameless thrall girl named Freya chose the quiet company of horses over the loud revelry. Hakon Oxenheart was the jarl's fiercest warrior, a giant among men with hands that had claimed countless lives. When he found her in that stable, she showed no fear. He found no judgment. Night after night, this unlikely pair shared grain and whispered words in the flickering firelight. She was everything he was not. He was everything she could never be. Yet somehow, their gentle friendship began to change them both. But what happens when a warrior's growing tenderness threatens everything he's built his reputation on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories to an old man's heart, reluctant to leave the familiar embrace of water and stone. Skarnvik sat nestled between towering cliffs and the restless sea, a village carved from necessity and hardened by generations of survival. The long houses stood in neat rows, their peaked roofs darkened by countless winters of smoke and snow, while the great long hall dominated the settlement's heart like a sleeping giant. Freya had risen before dawn, as was her custom. Her small hands moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered water from the well, the wooden bucket heavy against her hip. The carved handle bore the marks of countless other thralls who had walked this same path, worn smooth by desperate fingers and tired palms. She was perhaps 20 winters old, though no one had bothered to mark her birth. Her auburn hair hung in a simple braid down her back, and her eyes, the color of winter seas, held depths that spoke of understanding far beyond her years. The stable behind Bjorn's smithy had become her sanctuary. Here, among the gentle giants that carried warriors into battle, she found a peace that eluded her elsewhere. The horses knew nothing of her status as a thrall, cared nothing for the invisible chains that bound her to a life of service. They responded only to kindness, and kindness was something Freya possessed in abundance, despite having received so little herself. "Easy now, Stormwind," she murmured to the great grey stallion as she approached his stall. The horse was magnificent, nearly 16 hands tall, with a coat that shifted between silver and charcoal like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. He belonged to Hakon Oxenheart, though few dared approach the beast when its master was away on raids. Freya had no such fear. She had learned long ago that creatures, like people, responded to gentleness more readily than force. She poured grain into the worn wooden bowl she kept hidden beneath a pile of old sacking. The bowl was nothing special, roughly hewn from pine with edges smoothed by use, but it had become precious to her. It represented purpose, a small corner of the world where her actions mattered, where her care made a difference. Across the village, in the jarl's hall, another soul wrestled with the weight of expectations. Hakon Oxenheart sat at the high table, his massive frame making the sturdy oak bench creak with each movement. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and arms thick as ship masts, he was everything the Norse valued in a warrior. His beard, black as a raven's wing and braided with silver rings earned in battle, marked him as a man of consequence. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw told of a Saxon blade that had come too close to ending his story permanently. But this morning, as mead flowed and men boasted of their prowess in yesterday's raid, Hakon found himself strangely restless. The familiar rituals of victory, the recounting of brave deeds, the division of spoils, the planning of future conquests, felt hollow somehow. He had walked this path for 15 hours, since his voice had deepened and his first beard had sprouted. He had earned his place through blood and courage, had made his name feared from the Irish coast to the banks of the Volga. Yet lately, in the quiet moments between battles, he wondered what legacy he was truly building. Hakon, Eric Bloodaxe, the jarl's son, raised his horn high. "Tell them about the Saxon who thought he could stand against you." The assembled warriors turned expectant eyes toward him, eager for the tale they had heard a dozen times already. Hakon forced a smile and began the familiar recounting, his deep voice carrying easily across the hall. But even as he spoke of shield walls and sword work, part of his mind wandered to the stable where he had first encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about strength. It had been 3 nights ago, during the victory feast for their successful raid on the Orkney settlements. The hall had grown thick with smoke and louder with each passing hour. Men arm-wrestled and told increasingly boastful tales while serving women hurried between the benches, with trenchers of meat and horns of ale. The celebration was everything such gatherings were meant to be: raucous, proud, and thoroughly masculine. Yet Hakon had found himself growing increasingly restless as the night wore on. Perhaps it was the way young Olaf had described dispatching an elderly monk who had tried to protect the monastery's sacred books. The boy, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, had laughed as he recounted how the old man had died clutching a manuscript, his blood staining illuminated letters that had taken months to create. The other warriors had cheered the tale, but something in Hakon's chest had tightened with each word. He had slipped away from the celebration, stepping into the cool night air to clear his head. The contrast between the warm, noisy hall and the peaceful darkness outside had been jarring. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of mortal men. He had walked without purpose, his feet carrying him past the silent workshops and empty market stalls until he found himself behind the smithy. The stable door stood slightly ajar, and from within came a sound that stopped him in his tracks. Singing. Not the boisterous war songs that echoed from the long hall, but something softer, gentler. A lullaby, perhaps, or an old tune meant to soothe rather than inspire. He had approached carefully, his warrior's instincts making him cautious even in his own village. What he saw through the gap in the door had struck him like a physical blow. A slight figure knelt beside Stormwind, his own horse, the beast that most stable hands approached with fearful respect. The girl was singing softly as she brushed the stallion's coat, her movements sure and unhurried. The great war horse stood perfectly still, his usual restlessness replaced by an almost trance-like calm. Hakon had recognized her immediately, though he could not have said her name. She was one of the thralls, part of the near-invisible workforce that kept Skarnvik functioning. He had seen her hauling water, scrubbing floors, serving at feasts, always quiet, always efficient, always careful to avoid drawing attention to herself. But here, in this moment, she seemed transformed. Gone was the hunched posture of subservience. Instead, she moved with a natural grace, her voice carrying a warmth that made something deep in his chest ache with recognition. The grain bowl sat beside her, nearly empty. She had been feeding his horse. Not because she had been ordered to, but simply because the animal was hungry and she had the means to help. The simple generosity of the act had left him speechless. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she had not started or tried to flee as most thralls would have done. Instead, she had simply looked up at him with those remarkable gray-green eyes and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. No fear, no fawning deference, just calm recognition of his presence. He was restless, she had said quietly, her voice carrying the same gentle quality as her singing. I thought some grain might settle him. Hakon had found himself stepping into the stable, moving carefully so as not to spook either the horse or the girl. He can be difficult, he had replied, surprised by how rusty his voice sounded after the evening's boasting. All creatures can be difficult when they're troubled by something, she had answered, rising gracefully to her feet. Even standing, she barely reached his chest. But most troubles pass with a little kindness and patience. The simplicity of her observation had hit him harder than any sword blow. Here was wisdom earned not through battle and conquest, but through quiet observation and genuine care. They had stood in comfortable silence for several moments, watching as Stormwind lowered his great head to nuzzle at the remaining grain in the bowl. "What is your name?" he had asked finally. "Freya," she had replied, then added with a slight smile, "though most call me you there, or girl." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of her own invisibility had made his jaw clench with unexpected anger. Not at her, never at her, but at a world that could overlook someone capable of such gentle strength. "I am Hakon," he had said formally, as if introducing himself to another warrior rather than a thrall. "I know who you are," she had replied without a trace of mockery. "Everyone knows who you are." But something in her tone had suggested that she saw him differently than most, not as Hakon Oxenheart, the fearsome warrior, but simply as a man who had wandered into her peaceful sanctuary. Now 3 days later, as he finished recounting his battle prowess to an appreciative audience, Hakon found his thoughts returning to that stable and the woman who tended horses with such quiet devotion. He had returned each night since, drawn by something he could not name. Each time she had been there, and each time their conversations had grown a little longer, a little deeper. The other warriors began to disperse as the morning grew later, duties calling them to training grounds and workshops. Hakon remained seated, ostensibly finishing his meal, but actually wrestling with feelings he had no name for. In 15 years of raiding and battle, he had learned to trust his instincts. They had kept him alive when other men fell, had guided his sword through countless fights, had made him the warrior he was today. Those same instincts now told him that something fundamental was shifting in his life, like the ground settling after an earthquake. The change centered around a thrall girl with gentle hands and eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. Part of him, the practical part that had survived this long, warned him to stay away. Nothing good could come from a warrior developing feelings for a thrall. It violated every social boundary, every expectation of his station. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant so long he had forgotten it existed, hungered for the peace he found in her presence. In those quiet moments by the grain bowl, watching her calm his restless horse with nothing but patience and kindness, he had glimpsed a different way of being in the world. It was a way that measured strength not by the number of enemies slain, but by the capacity to nurture and protect. It was a way that found victory not in conquest, but in connection. The sun climbed higher over Skarnvik, painting the fjord in shades of gold and azure. Another day was beginning in the ancient rhythm of the settlement. Fishermen pushing their boats into the restless waves, craftsmen firing their forges, children learning the skills that would define their futures. And in the stable behind the smithy, a thrall girl with auburn hair prepared to feed the horses, unaware that her simple acts of kindness had begun to transform the heart of the village's greatest warrior. The fourth night changed everything. Freya had just finished her evening tasks in the great hall, scrubbing trenches, banking fires, sweeping rushes, when she heard the commotion from the harbor. Shouts echoed off the fjord walls, urgent and commanding. She paused in the doorway of the hall, listening as men called for rope and torches. A ship had returned, but not one that had been expected. Through the gathering dusk, she could see the outline of a vessel limping into port. Its sail hung in tatters, and even from a distance she could tell something was terribly wrong. The boat sat low in the water, listing to one side with the unmistakable signs of battle damage. Harold the blacksmith rushed past her, his leather apron still tied around his waist. "Survivors from the northern expedition," he called to no one in particular. "Looks like they ran into trouble." Freya's heart clenched. The northern expedition had departed 2 weeks ago under Gunnar Ironfist, the jarl's brother. 23 men had sailed north to trade with the settlements along the coast. She had watched Hakon debate whether to join them, ultimately deciding to remain in Skarnvik to oversee the village's defenses. She hurried toward the harbor, her worn shoes splashing through puddles left by the afternoon's rain. Other villagers streamed from their homes, drawn by the same urgent calls. Torches began to bloom like flowers in the gathering darkness, casting dancing shadows across anxious faces. The ship scraped against the wooden dock with a grinding sound that made everyone wince. Only 7 men stumbled onto the pier, 7 out of 23. They moved with the careful gait of the wounded, supporting each other as they fought to stay upright. Blood stained their clothes, and their eyes held the hollow look of men who had seen too much. Hakon emerged from the crowd, his massive frame cutting through the gathered villagers like a ship through waves. "Gunnar?" he called, his voice tight with concern. One of the survivors, a young man named Bjorn Redbeard, shook his head slowly. "Gone," he said, the word falling like a stone into still water. "They're all gone." The murmur that swept through the crowd was like wind through dry leaves. Gunnar Ironfist had been a legend in his own right, nearly as feared as the jarl himself. If he was dead, along with 16 other seasoned warriors, what happened? The jarl's voice cut through the whispers. Eric the Stern pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. Behind him came his son Eric Bloodaxe, hand already resting on his sword hilt. Bjorn Redbeard swayed on his feet, and 2 of his companions moved to steady him. A deep gash ran from his forehead to his cheek, barely scabbed over. "Slavers," he said, spitting the word like a curse, but not ordinary ones. These had discipline, strategy. They were waiting for us. Waiting how? Hakon's question came sharp as a blade. They knew we were coming, knew our route, our timing, had 3 ships positioned to trap us in the narrow inlet near Thornwick. We thought we were pursuing a damaged trader, but it was bait. Bjorn's voice cracked. They wanted prisoners, not plunder, took nets instead of swords. Gunnar and the others fought like wolves, but... He gestured helplessly at the 7 survivors. We only escaped because the tide turned and opened a gap we could slip through. But the others, they're gone, chained in the holds of ships heading south. The implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. Slavery was not uncommon. Most villages kept thralls taken in raids or bought in trade. But for Norse warriors to be taken as slaves themselves was an abomination that struck at the very heart of their identity. Freya watched from the edge of the gathering, her stomach turning cold. She knew what it meant to be property, to have no voice in your own fate. The thought of proud warriors like Gunnar Ironfist reduced to her own condition made something angry and protective flare in her chest. "There's more," another survivor spoke up. Olaf the Wise, the expedition's navigator. They asked questions before they took the others. Wanted to know about Skarnvik's defenses, our numbers, the jarl's plans for winter raids. A chill settled over the crowd that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was no random attack by opportunistic slavers. Someone was gathering information about their village, preparing for something larger. "They'll be back," Eric Bloodaxe said what everyone was thinking. "If they're bold enough to take Gunnar and his men, they won't stop there." The jarl's face had gone grey as storm clouds. "Double the watch. Send riders to the outlying farms. Everyone inside the palisade by tomorrow night. Hakon, I want a count of every able-bodied fighter in the village." As the crowd began to disperse, urgent conversations breaking out in small groups, Freya noticed that one of the survivors had collapsed. The man, she recognized him as young Sven, barely old enough for his first raid, sat slumped against a dock post, blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his thigh. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "He needs tending," she said to no one in particular, then knelt beside the injured warrior. "Can you walk?" Sven looked up at her with fevered eyes. I think so. Just need to rest a moment." "The leg needs proper cleaning before it festers," she said, examining the makeshift bandage. "And you need food and warmth." She began helping him to his feet, supporting his weight as best she could, despite the difference in their sizes. It was then she realized Hakon was watching her, his dark eyes unreadable in the torchlight. Take him to my house, Hakon said suddenly. I have clean water and bandages. Several of the other warriors looked surprised. It was unusual for someone of Hakon's status to open his home to a wounded subordinate, but no one questioned his decision. Freya found herself walking beside the giant warrior as they helped Sven through the village streets, her arm around the injured man's waist, while Hakon supported most of his weight. You have healing skills? Hakon asked as they walked. Some, Freya replied. You learn to tend wounds when no one else will do it for you. The simple truth of her statement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. She saw his jaw tighten, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition of the loneliness that had shaped her practical knowledge. Hakon's house stood near the village center, larger than most, but built with the same solid craftsmanship as the rest of Skarnvik. Inside, the main room was dominated by a central hearth, its fire casting warm light across simple but well-made furniture. Weapons hung on the walls, swords, axes, and shields that spoke of a warrior's life. But there were also unexpected touches. Books, which were rare and precious. A carved wooden chess set. A loom in one corner, though Freya could not imagine the fierce warrior weaving. My sisters, Hakon said, noticing her glance, before she married and moved to her husband's village. They settled Sven on a bench near the fire, and Freya set to work examining his wound. The gash was deep but clean, caused by a blade rather than the jagged tear of an axe. It will heal well if kept clean, she said, then looked around uncertainly. I would need hot water, clean cloth. Tell me what you need, Hakon said simply. For the next hour, she worked to clean and bind the wound while Hakon assisted with quiet efficiency. His large hands proved surprisingly gentle as he held bandages or steadied Sven when the pain made him flinch. There was something deeply peaceful about working together this way, their different skills complementing each other perfectly. As she tied off the final bandage, Sven had fallen into an exhausted sleep. The fever had broken and his breathing was steady and strong. You have a gift, Hakon said quietly. Freya shook her head. Just experience. Pain teaches its own lessons. And kindness? He asked. What teaches that? She met his eyes across the sleeping warrior. Perhaps the lack of it, she said simply. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. What had begun as chance encounters in a stable had become something deeper, more deliberate. The crisis of the attack had stripped away the careful social boundaries that normally separated them, revealing the simple truth that they worked well together, that their different strengths created something stronger than either possessed alone. But as they stood in the firelight, watching over a wounded warrior, while the village prepared for an uncertain future, both understood that everything was about to change. The attack on Gunnar's expedition was not an isolated incident. It was the first move in a larger game. And in that game, the connection growing between a thrall and a warrior might become either their greatest strength or their most dangerous vulnerability. The days following the survivors' return brought changes to Skarnvik that rippled through every aspect of village life. The easy rhythms of peacetime gave way to the sharp urgency of preparation. Men who had spent their mornings fishing or crafting now drilled with weapons in the training yard. Women who had gossiped over their looms now spoke in hushed tones about hidden food stores and escape routes. Freya found herself caught in the middle of these changes, her usual invisibility suddenly complicated by her new connection to Hakon. Word had spread quickly about how she had tended young Sven's wounds in the warrior's own home. Some of the other thralls looked at her with envy, wondering what favors she might have earned. Others watched with suspicion, as if her small rise in status somehow diminished their own prospects. Astrid, the head of the thrall women, cornered her while she was drawing water from the well. The older woman's face was pinched with disapproval, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. Getting ideas above yourself, are you? Astrid's voice carried the particular venom that the powerless reserved for those they perceived as threatening their small portion of security. Think because you played healer to one warrior, you're something special? Freya kept her eyes on the bucket, watching water slosh against the wooden sides. I helped a wounded man. Nothing more. Nothing more? Astrid repeated mockingly. Don't think I haven't heard about your nighttime visits to the stable. Don't think others haven't noticed Hakon Oxenheart watching you during the evening meal. The accusation hit closer to home than Freya cared to admit. She had noticed Hakon's attention during meals, the way his dark eyes would find her across the crowded hall. Each time their gazes met, something warm and dangerous stirred in her chest. A feeling she had taught herself long ago was futile for someone in her position. Careful, girl, Astrid continued, leaning closer. Men like him don't see thralls as anything more than temporary amusement, and when they're done amusing themselves, it's the woman who pays the price. Freya finally looked up, meeting the older woman's bitter gaze directly. Thank you for your concern, she said quietly, then lifted the heavy bucket and walked away before Astrid could respond. But the warning lingered in her mind as she went about her duties. She had seen what happened to thrall women who caught the attention of their betters. Some were lucky enough to become permanent concubines, gaining a measure of security in exchange for their bodies and silence. Others were discarded when the novelty wore off, left to face the scorn of their peers and the possibility of bearing children with no father to claim them. Yet when evening came and she made her way to the stable, she found she could not stay away. The horses needed tending, she told herself. Someone had to care for the animals while their owners prepared for war. But deep down, she knew the truth. She went because she hoped to find Hakon there, hoped for another of their quiet conversations that had become the bright center of her increasingly complicated days. He was already there when she arrived, standing beside Stormwind with a leather bridle in his hands. The great horse stood patiently while his master checked every strap and buckle, preparing the equipment for battle. "How is Sven?" she asked, setting down her grain bowl and reaching for the brush she kept hidden behind a loose board. "Healing well, thanks to your skill," Hakon replied without looking up from his work. "The wound is clean, and he's already talking about returning to training." "Men," she said with a small smile, beginning to brush the coat of a brown mare, always eager to return to the very activities that injured them in the first place. "Then women are different?" he asked, and she heard the amusement in his voice. "Women learn to avoid injury in the first place," she replied. "We have to. We rarely get second chances." The observation seemed to give him pause. He set down the bridle and looked at her directly. "Is that what you think this is? Your second chance?" The question caught her off guard. She continued brushing the mare's coat, using the rhythmic motion to steady her thoughts. "I don't know what this is," she said finally. "I know it's dangerous. I know it breaks every rule about how people like us are supposed to interact." "People like us," he repeated slowly. "You mean a warrior and a thrall." "I mean a man who has choices and a woman who has none." The bluntness of her statement hung between them like a challenge. She had learned to speak plainly about her circumstances. It saved time and prevented misunderstandings. But she wondered if she had gone too far, if her honesty would drive him away. Instead, he moved closer, his massive presence filling the small space beside the mare's stall. "What if I told you that some choices are illusions?" he said quietly. "What if I said that a warrior's life is as constrained as a thrall's, just by different chains?" She looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "What chains bind Hakon Oxenheart?" "Expectation," he said immediately. "Reputation. The knowledge that any sign of weakness will be seen as failure. The need to be constantly stronger, fiercer, more ruthless than the men around me." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to the scar that ran along his jaw. "Do you know how I got this mark?" She shook her head. A Saxon warrior, barely old enough to hold a sword properly. He was defending his village's church while we burned everything around him. He should have run. Any sensible person would have run. But he stood there with his little blade, protecting something he believed was sacred. Hakon's voice grew distant. I could have taken him prisoner, could have spared him. But my men were watching, and Hakon Oxenheart doesn't show mercy to enemies. So you killed him. I killed him. The words came out flat, final. And his blade opened my face as he died, giving me this permanent reminder of what I chose, what I had to choose. Freya set down the brush and turned to face him fully. You had no choice. That's what I told myself. But lying here in this stable with you, watching you gentle these great beasts with nothing but patience and kindness, I wonder if there might have been another way. If strength might mean something different than what I've always believed. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. They stood in the flickering lamplight, separated by all the barriers of class and circumstance, yet connected by something deeper than either fully understood. The other thralls are talking, she said finally, needing to voice the reality that threatened their fragile connection. They think I'm reaching above my station. And what do you think? She considered the question seriously. I think that kindness recognizes no boundaries. That when two people find peace in each other's company, the world's rules become less important than their own truth. A dangerous philosophy for a thrall. All the best philosophies are dangerous, she replied. That's why they're worth having. He smiled at that. A real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. You continue to surprise me, Freya of no last name. And you continue to visit a stable when you could be in the warm hall with men who understand your world. Perhaps, he said quietly, I'm tired of being understood in all the expected ways. The bronze arm ring arrived 3 days later, carried by a messenger whose ship bore the mark of the southern traders. Eric the Stern received the man in his great hall, while the village's most trusted warriors gathered around the high table. Freya, serving ale to the assembled men, moved as quietly as possible while straining to hear every word. The messenger was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly as he presented the ring to the jarl. From Ragnar the Black, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He sends greetings to his northern brothers. The arm ring was beautiful in its own way, intricately carved bronze depicting ravens in flight, with silver inlays that caught the firelight. But the beauty only made its message more ominous. Such gifts were never given freely. They came with expectations, demands, or threats carefully disguised as hospitality. Eric turned the ring over in his weathered hands, his expression growing darker with each moment. And what does Ragnar the Black want in exchange for his generous gift? Safe passage through your waters, the messenger replied. Permission to winter in the sheltered bay south of your village, and perhaps cooperation in certain ventures that would benefit both your peoples. Hakon leaned forward from his place at the jarl's right hand. What kind of ventures? The messenger's eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape routes. The kind that require men of courage and ships that can move quickly. The southern kingdoms grow fat and careless. Their monasteries overflow with gold. Their merchants travel with poorly guarded caravans. Surely warriors of your reputation understand the opportunities such weakness presents. And the prisoners he's already taken? Eric Bloodaxe's voice cut like a blade. Our kinsman Gunnar Ironfist and his men, where are they? Safe, the messenger said quickly. Treated with all the honor due to brave warriors. Ragnar the Black has great respect for their courage. He hopes they might choose to join his enterprise willingly. The lie sat heavy in the hall's warm air. Everyone present knew that captured warriors were given simple choices: swear loyalty to their captors or face slavery or death. Gunnar Ironfist was many things, but he would never willingly serve the man who had ambushed his expedition. And if we refuse this generous offer? Eric the Stern's voice was deceptively calm. The messenger swallowed hard. Ragnar the Black has many ships, many men. Winter is coming and supplies grow scarce. It would be unfortunate if misunderstandings arose between peoples who should be allies. The threat was clear enough. Submit to Ragnar's demands, or face the consequences when his fleet arrived in force. The messenger was dismissed with formal courtesy, but the tension in the hall could have been cut with a blade. After the man had gone, Eric threw the bronze ring onto the table with enough force to make the other men flinch. "Ragnar the Black thinks to make vassals of us," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "He takes our warriors, threatens our shores, and has the gall to call it friendship." "How many ships does he command?" Hakon asked the question everyone was thinking. "The survivors said at least 3 attacked the expedition," replied Bjorn Redbeard from his place near the fire. His wounds had healed enough for him to take part in planning sessions, though he still moved carefully. But if he's truly planning to winter nearby, he'll have more. "Double that for safety," Eric Bloodaxe added grimly. "Maybe triple. A man doesn't make threats like these unless he has the strength to back them up." Freya continued her serving duties, but her mind raced as she listened to the discussion. 6 to 9 ships meant potentially 300 warriors or more, far outnumbering Skarnvik's defenders. The village's palisade was strong, but it had been built to repel small raiding parties, not organized fleets. "We could send word to our allies," suggested one of the older warriors. "The settlements along the coast would stand with us if they knew the threat. And give Ragnar time to strike first?" Eric the Stern shook his head. "No, if we're to fight, we fight with what we have. Send riders to bring in the outlying families, but quietly. Let Ragnar think we're considering his offer while we prepare." As the meeting broke up into smaller planning sessions, Freya made her way back to the kitchens to help with the evening's cleanup. But her thoughts remained fixed on the bronze arm ring and what it represented. She had seen the effects of such cooperation before, in her own village's final days. The pattern was always the same: threats disguised as opportunities, demands that grew larger with each concession until nothing remained but submission or destruction. Later that evening, she found Hakon in the stable, as had become their custom, but tonight he sat heavily on a wooden stool, his usual purposeful energy replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "You heard about the messenger," he said without looking up. She nodded, settling beside him with her grain bowl. "The bronze ring with ravens. Very dramatic." "Ragnar's symbol," Hakon explained. "He's been building his reputation for the past 5 years, gathering ships and men from across the northern seas. They say he once sacked 3 monasteries in a single day, then burned the ships of the monks who tried to escape with their treasures. And now he wants Skarnvik to join his enterprise, or be destroyed by it." Hakon finally looked at her, and she saw the weight of responsibility in his dark eyes. "Eric is a good jarl, but he's never faced anything like this. Most of our enemies have been local rivals or small raiding parties. Ragnar commands a fleet." Freya continued brushing Stormwind's coat, using the familiar motion to think through what she had heard. "The messenger seemed nervous," she said finally. "Afraid, even. That's not how a man acts when he's delivering terms from a position of absolute strength." Hakon straightened slightly. "What do you mean?" "If Ragnar truly had overwhelming force, he wouldn't need to send gifts and veiled threats. He could simply arrive with his fleet and demand submission. The fact that he's trying to recruit allies suggests he's not as strong as he wants us to believe." The observation struck Hakon like a physical blow. "You think he's bluffing?" "Partially, perhaps. Or maybe he genuinely prefers cooperation to conquest. Either way, the messenger's fear tells us something important. Ragnar's position isn't as secure as he wants us to think." She paused in her brushing. "The question is what we do with that knowledge." "We?" Hakon asked quietly. "I've lived through the destruction of one village already," she said simply. "I won't stand by and watch it happen to another if there's something I can do to help." "And what could you do? No disrespect intended, but you're a thrall with no voice in your war councils," she finished. I know what I am, Hakon, but I also know what I've survived. I've seen how these conflicts develop, how they can be won or lost, based on things that warriors don't always consider. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. What things? Supply lines, morale, information, the little details that determine whether an army succeeds or fails. She set down the brush and faced him directly. Ragnar may have ships and warriors, but he's operating far from his home base. That means everything he needs must come with him or be taken from others. It makes him powerful, but also vulnerable in ways he might not recognize. You're talking about strategy, Hakon said with something like wonder in his voice. I'm talking about survival, she corrected. When you have nothing and no one to protect you, you learn to see patterns that others miss. You learn to find advantages where none seem to exist. She paused. The bronze arm ring isn't just a threat, it's also information. It tells us Ragnar wants something from Skarnvik badly enough to risk revealing his intentions early. The question is what that something might be. The iron spearhead lay on Eric the Stern's table like an accusation, its blade still stained with blood that had dried to a rust-brown crust. Another messenger had arrived that morning, this one barely alive, clutching the spear that had nearly killed him. His message was shorter and far more direct than the bronze arm ring's diplomatic threats. 3 days, he had gasped before collapsing in the hall. Ragnar comes in 3 days. Submit or burn. Now the village leaders gathered around the weapon, their faces grim in the firelight. The spearhead was crudely made but effective, the kind of weapon carried by raiders who cared more for killing than craftsmanship. Blood still clung to its edges, and Freya, refilling ale horns at the table's edge, felt her stomach turn as she recognized what that meant. He killed the messenger's companion to make his point, Eric Bloodaxe said what everyone was thinking. Drove this through the man's chest and sent his partner running back to us with the blade still warm. The question, Eric the Stern said heavily, is whether we have enough time to prepare. 3 days isn't long to ready defenses against a fleet. Or to evacuate the village, added Olaf the Wise. If we sent the women and children inland now, with small groups of guards. No. Hakon's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. If we scatter our people, we make ourselves weaker. Ragnar's ships can move faster than families with children and elderly. He'd hunt down the groups one by one. Then we make our stand here, Eric Bloodaxe said, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Behind the palisade, with whatever force we can muster. Freya continued her duties, but her mind was working through everything she had observed about the village's defenses. The palisade was strong, but not impregnable. The harbor could be blocked, but not quickly enough to prevent ships from landing. Most critically, Skarnvik's fresh water came from wells within the village walls, easily poisoned or fouled by attackers who gained access to the central area. As the meeting continued, she found herself studying the bloody spearhead with growing certainty that something was wrong. The weapon was crude, yes, but the blood pattern was too perfect, too deliberately placed. Real battle blood dried differently, scattered in sprays and drops rather than the neat coating she saw here. The blood is pig's blood, she said quietly, then immediately regretted speaking. The conversation stopped abruptly, and every eye in the hall turned to her. What did you say? Eric the Stern's voice was dangerously calm. The blood on the spearhead? She repeated, knowing she had already committed herself. It's pig's blood, not human. Human blood turns darker as it dries, and it doesn't coat metal so evenly. The silence that followed felt dangerous. She had violated every rule of her station by speaking uninvited in a war council. But as she looked around the table, she saw not anger but thoughtful consideration on several faces. How would you know such things? Eric Bloodaxe asked. Because I've cleaned both from weapons and clothing, she answered simply. When you prepare warriors for burial, you learn to distinguish between different types of blood. Hakon leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. You think the entire message was theatrical? I think someone wanted us to believe a man died for this spear, but they weren't willing to actually kill anyone for it. She paused, gathering courage for her next words. Which suggests that Ragnar's position might be even weaker than we thought. Eric the Stern picked up the spearhead, examining it more closely. Pig's blood, he muttered. Clever staging, if you're right. Makes us think he's ruthless enough to kill messengers while avoiding the actual cost of losing men. It could also mean he's trying to end this without a fight, Hakon suggested. A man with overwhelming force doesn't need to resort to tricks with pig's blood. He simply arrives and demonstrates his power. Or, Bjorn Redbeard added grimly, it means he's playing a deeper game than we understand, testing our responses, gathering information about how we think and react. The discussion that followed was unlike anything Freya had ever witnessed. Instead of dismissing her observations, the warriors began incorporating them into their strategic thinking. They examined the spearhead from multiple angles, discussed the implications of theatrical versus genuine threats, and gradually developed a more nuanced picture of their enemy. If Ragnar is weaker than he appears, Eric the Stern said finally, then our response becomes more important. Show too much fear, and we encourage him to attack. Show too little, and we might miss a chance for negotiation. What kind of negotiation? Hakon asked. The kind where we make him understand that Skarnvik won't be easily taken, but where we also leave him room to withdraw without losing face. The jarl's weathered features showed the careful calculation of a man who had survived decades of Viking politics. Sometimes the best victory is the one that never becomes a battle. As the meeting began to break up into smaller planning groups, Freya started to withdraw to the kitchens, but Hakon caught her arm gently as she passed. Stay, he said quietly. Your insights have value here. I'm a thrall, she reminded him. I have no place in war councils. You're someone who sees details that warriors miss, he corrected. And right now, those details might save lives. She looked around the room, noting the mixture of acceptance and uncertainty on the other men's faces. Some, like Eric the Stern and Bjorn Redbeard, seemed genuinely interested in her perspective. Others, particularly Eric Bloodaxe, watched her with thinly veiled suspicion. Very well, she said finally. But I should point out that if Ragnar is using theatrical tactics, he's also likely gathering information about our responses. Every decision we make from now on sends him a message about our capabilities and intentions. What do you suggest? Eric the Stern asked. That we be very careful about what messages we send, she replied, and that we consider sending some messages of our own. The iron spearhead lay between them on the table, its false blood catching the firelight like a reminder of the deceptions that warfare could contain. But for Freya, it had become something else, proof that her voice had value in this room of warriors, that her perspective could contribute to her adopted village's survival. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in her life, her words carried weight beyond the small sphere of daily tasks and quiet kindnesses. But with that influence came responsibility and the growing awareness that the choices made in this room would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone she had come to care about, including the giant warrior who sat beside her, his presence both protective and dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. The silver coin arrived at dawn, carried by a raven that landed on the jarl's windowsill as if summoned. The bird waited patiently while Eric the Stern removed the small pouch tied to its leg, then flew away without the usual cawing that ravens made when disturbed. The silence of its departure felt as ominous as the message it carried. Inside the leather pouch, wrapped in silk that spoke of southern wealth, lay a single silver coin bearing Ragnar's mark. The same ravens that had adorned the bronze arm ring, but this time etched with meticulous detail into precious metal. On the reverse side, scratched in runes that looked freshly carved, was a simple message. Tonight, the standing stones. Come alone. Eric the Stern studied the coin by the light of the great hall's fire, his weathered face troubled. "He wants to meet," he announced to the warriors who had gathered for the morning meal. "Just him and me, apparently." "It's a trap," Eric Bloodaxe said immediately. "No one arranges secret meetings with enemies unless they mean treachery." "Perhaps," his father replied, turning the coin over in his palm, "or perhaps he's having the same doubts about this conflict that we are. A man who resorts to pig's blood on spearheads might genuinely prefer negotiation to battle." Hakon leaned forward from his place at the high table. "The Standing Stones are a day's ride north. Neutral ground, but far from any help if things go wrong." "Which is exactly why he chose that place," Bjorn Redbeard added. "Forces both sides to come with minimal support, makes treachery costly for everyone involved." Freya, serving porridge to the assembled men, found herself studying the coin as she worked. The craftsmanship was exceptional, far better than the crude iron spearhead from the previous day. This piece had been made by a master silversmith, probably in one of the great trading cities to the south. But what caught her attention was not the quality of the work, but a small detail that the warriors had missed. The raven's eyes were inlaid with tiny garnets, dark red stones that glowed like drops of blood in the firelight. Such work was incredibly expensive, the kind of detail that spoke of either vast wealth or desperate importance. Men didn't waste such craftsmanship on simple messages unless those messages carried weight beyond their words. "Jarl Eric," she said quietly, then immediately wondered at her own boldness. Since yesterday's acceptance in the War Council, she had been walking a dangerous line between usefulness and presumption. "Might I examine the coin?" Several warriors looked surprised by her request, but Eric the Stern handed her the silver piece without question. She turned it carefully in her fingers, noting details that spoke to her hard-won knowledge of valuable objects. "This wasn't made recently," she said after a moment. "The wear patterns on the edges suggest it's been handled regularly for months or years. And the garnets in the raven's eyes, that's southern craftsmanship, probably from Byzantium or even further abroad." "Meaning what?" Eric Bloodaxe asked with barely concealed impatience. "Meaning this coin has personal significance to Ragnar," she replied. "Men don't carry tokens of such value unless they represent something important. A victory, a vow, a memory. He's not just sending a message about tonight's meeting. He's sending something that matters to him personally." The implications hung in the air like smoke from the fire. If Ragnar was willing to risk a token of personal value, it suggested that tonight's meeting carried weight beyond simple tactical maneuvering. It could still be an elaborate trap, Hakon pointed out, but his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. A man might sacrifice something precious if it helped him achieve a greater goal. "True," Freya agreed. "But it could also mean he's genuinely seeking a solution that doesn't involve destroying either of our forces. The coin tells us this meeting matters to him beyond mere strategy." Eric the Stern was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried significant risks. "I'll go," he decided finally. "But not alone. Hakon, you'll accompany me as far as the valley below the stones. Close enough to help if needed, far enough to avoid appearing threatening." "And if it is a trap?" Bjorn Redbeard asked. "Then you'll know when we don't return by dawn, and you'll lead the village's defense." The Jarl's voice carried the weight of a man making final preparations. "Make sure the palisade is ready, the wells are guarded, and the signal fires are prepared on the heights." As the meeting dispersed into urgent preparation, Freya found herself walking beside Hakon toward the stables. The silver coin remained in her thoughts, its personal significance to Ragnar suggesting complexities in this conflict that went beyond simple predator and prey. "You think he really wants to negotiate?" Hakon asked as they checked Stormwind's tack. "I think he wants something," she replied carefully. "Whether that's negotiation or simply better intelligence about our defenses, I can't say. But the coin suggests this isn't entirely about conquest. What else could it be about?" She considered the question as she ran her hands along Stormwind's flanks, checking for any signs of strain or injury that might affect his performance if speed became necessary. Reputation, perhaps, or legacy. Sometimes men who build their power through conquest reach a point where they need to prove they can achieve goals through other means. And sometimes, Hakon said grimly, they simply want to look their enemies in the eye before they destroy them. The truth was that none of them could know Ragnar's true intentions until the meeting occurred, but as Freya watched Hakon prepare for the night's dangerous journey, she felt the weight of how much their lives had changed since that first meeting in this same stable. Then, he had been simply Hakon Oxenheart, the village's greatest warrior. Now, he was something far more precious and vulnerable, a man whose safety had become essential to her own sense of purpose and belonging. "Be careful tonight," she said quietly as he adjusted Stormwind's bridle. "Whatever Ragnar wants, don't let pride or honor make you take unnecessary risks." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "And what if honor requires risk?" "Then make sure the risk serves a purpose worth the cost," she replied. "Dead heroes protect no one." The silver coin lay heavy in Eric the Stern's pouch as the day wore toward evening. Whatever message it carried would be revealed soon enough at the ancient standing stones, where generations of leaders had met to settle disputes that words alone could not resolve. But for Freya, the coin had already delivered its most important message, that the conflict approaching Skarnvik was more complex than anyone had initially understood, and that the simplest solutions were often the most dangerous to pursue. The standing stones rose from the moor like the bones of giants, their ancient surfaces carved with runes that predated the village of Skarnvik by centuries. Eric the Stern approached the sacred circle as the last light faded from the western sky, his hand resting lightly on his sword hilt. The weight of the silver coin in his pouch seemed to grow heavier with each step. Hakon waited in the valley below, hidden among the twisted birch trees that bordered the ancient site. From his position, he could see the stones silhouetted against the darkening sky, but the dancing shadows made it impossible to determine if anyone already waited within the circle. The jarl stepped between two massive stones and into the sacred space, his boots crunching softly on the gravel that had been worn smooth by countless generations of pilgrims and petitioners. At first, the circle appeared empty. Then a figure emerged from behind the largest stone, not the imposing war chief Eric had expected, but a woman. She was perhaps 40 winters old, with silver threading through auburn hair that had once been the same shade as Freya's. Her clothes spoke of wealth and status. Fine wool dyed deep blue, silver arm rings that caught the starlight, and a cloak bordered with intricate embroidery. But it was her face that stopped Eric cold, features that struck him with the force of recognition even though he was certain they had never met. "You're not Ragnar the Black," he said carefully. "No," she replied, her voice carrying the educated cadence of the southern kingdoms. "I am Astrid Eriksdottir, and I have come in his place to speak of matters that concern us both." The name hit Eric like a physical blow. Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of a jarl, sister to a king, and one of the most formidable women in the northern lands. She had disappeared 3 years ago during a voyage to establish trade routes with the Byzantine Empire, presumed lost at sea along with her entire expedition. Her survival was shocking enough, but her apparent connection to Ragnar raised questions that made Eric's mind reel. "Lady Astrid," he said formally, inclining his head in the respect due her birth and reputation, "we believed you dead. Your brother Eric of Hedmark still mourns your loss." "As well he might," she replied with a bitter smile. "The woman he knew is indeed dead. What stands before you now is someone who has learned truths that no high-born lady should ever have to face." She moved closer, and in the starlight, Eric could see the changes that 3 years had wrought. There was a hardness to her features that had not been there before, a wariness in her eyes that spoke of experiences that had stripped away illusions and left only practical wisdom. "Ragnar saved my life," she continued. when my own crew sold me to slavers for the price of safe passage home. He freed me from chains, gave me shelter when my own people had abandoned me, and eventually he gave me a choice no man had ever offered before, the freedom to choose my own path. And you chose to sail with him. I chose to help him build something better than the endless cycle of raid and revenge that defines most of our people's lives. Her voice carried conviction, but also a deep weariness. Do you know what I learned in those slave markets, Eric the Stern? I learned that the children we take in our raids grow up to raid our children in return. I learned that the gold we steal today becomes the weapons that kill our people tomorrow. Eric felt the ground shifting beneath his certainties. You speak of ending the raiding life? That's been the Norse way for generations. And where has it led us? She demanded. To a world where every hand is raised against every other hand, where no settlement can trust its neighbors, where children grow up knowing they'll die by violence if they live long enough. Ragnar saw the futility of it before I did, but together we've been building something different. The attacks on our people were not attacks, she interrupted. They were rescues. The men you call prisoners are alive and well, living freely in our settlement to the south. Some have chosen to stay and help us build a new kind of community. Others have gone home with messages we hoped would lead to conversations like this one. Eric stared at her in disbelief. Gunnar Ironfist chose to join Ragnar willingly. Gunnar Ironfist chose to see beyond the lies that keep us locked in endless warfare, she corrected, just as you have the choice to see them now. The revelation struck Eric with the force of a lightning bolt. Everything they had assumed about Ragnar's intentions, everything they had prepared to defend against, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually happening. The evidence that had seemed so clear, the damaged ship, the survivor's account, the theatrical messages, took on entirely different meanings when viewed through this new lens. The pig's blood on the spearhead, Eric said slowly, pieces falling into place. You were testing our intelligence. We were trying to avoid unnecessary deaths while demonstrating that we understood your capabilities better than you might expect. Astrid smiled grimly. Your thrall girl's observation was particularly impressive. Ragnar will be interested to hear that Skarnvik has advisors capable of such insight. How do you know about? Eric began, then stopped as the implications became clear. You've been watching us. Of course we have. Just as you would watch any settlement before attempting to make contact. But what we've seen has given us hope that Skarnvik might be ready for a different kind of alliance than the one we've offered to other villages. She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small wooden carving. A delicate horse, no larger than a child's fist, crafted with extraordinary skill and attention to detail. This came from your village, she said. Made by someone who understands that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to create and protect. Eric recognized the carving immediately. It was Freya's work, one of several small figures she had carved during the long winter evenings. He had seen her making them by the firelight, her hands moving with the same gentle precision she brought to tending the horses. But how had such a thing reached Astrid's hands? One of your trading partners carries messages as well as goods, Astrid explained, seeing his confusion. He spoke of a thrall woman whose kindness to animals had become legendary among the traveling merchants. A woman who cared for horses with such gentleness that even the wildest stallions calmed at her touch. The carved horse lay in Astrid's palm like an accusation. Ragnar believes that a village capable of producing such art, such compassion, might be ready to move beyond the old ways of blood and conquest. He hopes that Skarnvik might become part of something larger, a network of communities committed to trade and cooperation rather than endless raiding. Eric felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of iron. Everything he had believed about the threat facing his village had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. Ragnar the Black was not the marauding war chief they had expected, but a man trying to build a different kind of future. The choice he now faced was not between submission and resistance, but between the familiar patterns of the past and an uncertain but potentially transformative future. And if we refuse this alliance? He asked. Then you refuse it, Astrid replied simply. We'll withdraw our ships and leave you to face the real threats that gather in the north, the kingdoms that truly do seek conquest rather than cooperation. But I hope you'll consider what we're offering and what it might mean for your people's children. She pressed the wooden horse into his hands. Keep this as a token of what's possible when strength serves creation rather than destruction, and remember that the woman who carved it sees possibilities that warriors often miss. As she turned to leave, Eric called after her. Why? Reveal yourself. Why not let us continue believing you are dead? Because, she said without turning around, some truths are too important for deception, no matter how convenient that deception might be. Your people deserve to make their choice based on reality rather than the comfortable lies that keep us trapped in old patterns. She vanished into the darkness beyond the stones, leaving Eric alone with the carved horse and the knowledge that everything he thought he knew about their situation had just been revealed as illusion. The small wooden figure seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, a reminder of the gentle hands that had shaped it and the profound questions that those hands represented about the nature of true strength. The leather map spread across Eric the Stern's table like a promise and a threat combined. Drawn on carefully prepared calfskin and marked with symbols that spoke of months of careful observation, it showed the northern seas as no one in Skarnvik had ever seen them before. Trade routes connected distant settlements in an intricate web of commerce and cooperation, while red marks indicated the true threats gathering in the far north. Kingdoms that still lived by the old ways of conquest and pillage. Eric had returned from the Standing Stones with revelations that shook the foundations of everything the village leaders thought they understood. Now, as dawn light filtered through the hall's windows, he shared Astrid Eriksdottir's offer with men who struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was being proposed. You're saying Gunnar Ironfist is alive and well? Bjorn Redbeard asked for the third time, his scarred face showing the confusion they all felt. More than alive, Eric replied, pointing to a mark on the map that represented Ragnar's main settlement. According to Lady Astrid, he's helping to train warriors in new fighting techniques, ways to defend against raids while minimizing casualties on both sides. Defending against raids by not raiding, Eric Bloodaxe said skeptically. How do we feed our people without the wealth that successful expeditions bring? Through trade, Eric the Stern answered, running his finger along the network of routes shown on the map. Lady Astrid claims their alliance controls sea lanes that generate more steady wealth than any raiding season could provide. Hakon studied the map with the intensity he usually reserved for battle plans. These settlements to the south, do they all participate willingly in this alliance? She says they do. More importantly, she says they've been able to defend themselves against the traditional raiding fleets that still operate in the northern waters. Eric pointed to a cluster of red marks. These are the real threats. King Ivar the Bloody has been gathering ships all summer, planning winter raids on anyone who won't join his confederation of war chiefs. The implications were staggering. If Astrid spoke the truth, then Skarnvik faced a choice between two very different futures. Join Ragnar's trade alliance and abandon the raiding traditions that had sustained them for generations, or face King Ivar's war fleet with whatever forces they could muster alone. Freya entered the hall, carrying a tray of ale horns, but she moved more slowly than usual, listening intently to every word of the discussion. Since Eric's return, she had been trying to process the revelation that her small wooden horse carving had played a role in diplomatic negotiations she never could have imagined. There's another consideration, Hakon said quietly. Lady Astrid specifically mentioned the wisdom of our advisors. She knows about Freya's insights regarding the pig's blood and other details. Eric Bloodaxe snorted. You think that matters? One thrall's observations hardly qualify us for alliance with southern kingdoms. It matters because it shows we're capable of thinking beyond traditional warrior perspectives. Eric the Stern corrected his son firmly. Something Lady Astrid seemed to value highly. As the debate continued, Freya found herself studying the map with growing fascination. The trade routes formed patterns that reminded her of something she had observed in her own small world, the paths that horses naturally chose when moving between pastures, following lines of least resistance while avoiding obvious dangers. "Jarl Eric," she said quietly, then immediately questioned her boldness in speaking. But the events of recent days had changed something fundamental about her place in these discussions. "Might I examine the map more closely?" The conversation paused as Eric gestured for her to approach. She set down the tray and leaned over the table, tracing the marked routes with her finger. "These paths," she said after a moment, "they follow natural currents and seasonal wind patterns. Whoever planned these routes understands the sea the way I understand horse behavior. Not through force, but through cooperation with natural tendencies." "Meaning what?" Hakon asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand her observations. "Meaning this alliance isn't just about avoiding warfare. It's about working with the natural order instead of constantly fighting against it." She looked up from the map, meeting Eric's eyes directly. "The old raiding patterns require going against currents, fighting weather, taking what you can grab quickly. These routes suggest a different approach entirely." "You see strategy in trade routes," Eric Bloodaxe said with unconcealed skepticism. What could a thrall possibly understand about such matters? "I understand survival," Freya replied calmly. "And I understand that the strongest animals are often those that find ways to thrive without constant conflict." The observation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of them had considered. If Ragnar's alliance truly represented a more sustainable way of life, then the choice facing Skarnvik went beyond simple tactics or diplomacy. It touched the fundamental question of what kind of future they wanted to build. "The timing troubles me," Bjorn Redbeard said finally. "Why approach us now? Why not earlier in the summer when weather was better for negotiation?" "Because King Ivar's plans are accelerating," Eric answered, pointing to intelligence marks on the map. "Lady Astrid showed me evidence that he intends to move before winter. If settlements like ours don't choose sides soon, we may find ourselves facing his fleet without any allies at all." The pressure of decision weighed heavily on everyone present. Throughout the morning, riders had been arriving with reports from the outlying farms and fishing stations. Smoke had been seen on the northern horizon, ships moving in formations too large for simple trading expeditions. Whatever choice they made would have to be made quickly. "We need more information," Hakon said finally. "About this alliance, about King Ivar's true intentions, about what joining either side would actually mean for our people." "Lady Astrid offered to provide that information," Eric replied. "She's invited a delegation from Skarnvik to visit their main settlement, see their community firsthand, meet with Gunnar and the others, evaluate their claims about sustainable prosperity." "And if it's an elaborate trap," Eric Bloodaxe demanded, "if we send our best leaders south only to find ourselves hostages?" "Then we'll learn whether their promises about cooperation extend to how they treat guests," Eric the Stern answered. "But we'll also learn whether we're dealing with people who honor their word or simply clever slavers with better presentation." Freya found herself thinking about the wooden horse carving that had apparently traveled from her hands to Astrid Eriksdottir's possession. The chain of contacts and communications that made such a transfer possible suggested a network far more sophisticated than anything she had imagined. Whether that network served cooperation or exploitation remained to be seen, but its existence was undeniable. "Who would go?" Hakon asked. "A small group. Perhaps 3 people. Enough to evaluate what we find. Not so many that we weaken our defenses here." Eric paused, his gaze moving around the table. "One warrior, one leader who can speak for the village and—" His eyes settled on Freya, and she felt her heart skip. "Someone who can evaluate their claims about different ways of building strength. Someone who understands that power can take forms other than sword work." "You're suggesting we send a thrall to negotiate with foreign kingdoms?" Eric Bloodaxe's voice was sharp with disbelief. I'm suggesting we send someone whose insights have already proven valuable in understanding our enemy's true intentions, his father replied firmly. Someone whose carved horse apparently impressed Lady Astrid enough to mention specifically. The idea was so far beyond anything Freya had ever imagined that she felt dizzy. To leave Skarnvik, to see other settlements, to participate in negotiations that could determine her village's future, it was like being offered the chance to fly. But it was also terrifying. Everything she had built in Skarnvik, her place in the stable, her growing connection to Hakon, her small sphere of safety and purpose, all of it would be left behind for an uncertain journey into unknown territory. The risk, she began, is considerable, Eric agreed. For all of us. But the potential reward is a future where your skills at reading character and situation could help build something better than endless cycles of warfare. The leather map lay before them like a doorway to possibilities none of them fully understood. Red marks showed the approaching threats, while the network of trade routes offered an alternative that might prove salvation or trap. As the morning wore toward afternoon, with riders bringing increasingly urgent reports of northern ship movements, the weight of decision pressed down on them all. Soon, very soon, they would have to choose between the familiar dangers of the old ways and the uncertain promise of something entirely new. The polished bone chess piece sat in the center of the great table like a small ivory warrior, its carved features worn smooth by countless games played over many years. But this morning, it represented far more than entertainment. It was Ragnar's reply to their decision to send a delegation, carried by the same raven that had delivered previous messages. The piece was a horse, carved with the same attention to detail that Freya had put into her wooden version. But where hers had been simple pine shaped by practical tools, this was clearly the work of a master craftsman using materials that spoke of wealth and sophistication. The message it carried was unmistakable. Ragnar not only welcomed their delegation, but understood the significance of what had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow at dawn, Eric the Stern announced to the assembled delegation, Lady Astrid's ship will meet us at the southern bay, 3 days to reach their settlement, evaluate their claims, and return with our decision. Freya stood beside Hakon and Bjorn Redbeard, still struggling to believe she was part of this diplomatic mission. The leather pack at her feet contained everything she owned, a few changes of clothing, her carving tools, and the worn grain bowl that had become so central to her life in Skarnvik. It seemed impossibly small preparation for a journey that could change everything. Remember, Eric continued, you go as observers and evaluators, not as negotiators. Your task is to learn whether their promises align with reality, whether their alliance offers genuine security and prosperity, and whether our people would thrive in such an arrangement. Hakon shifted beside her, and she could sense his tension. For him, this journey represented not just diplomatic responsibility, but personal risk of the highest order. If their assessment was wrong, if Ragnar's offers proved false or dangerous, the consequences would fall not just on the delegation, but on everyone they had left behind. What of King Ivar's ships? Bjorn asked, voicing the concern that shadowed all their preparations. The scouts report at least 15 vessels moving south along the coast. If they reach Skarnvik while we're gone, then the village will defend itself with the plans we've made, Eric replied grimly. The palisade is strong, the wells are guarded, and Eric Bloodaxe knows his duties, but our hope is that this journey will provide information that makes such defense unnecessary. The bone chess piece caught the morning light, its polished surface reflecting the fire like captured starlight. Freya found herself studying the craftsmanship, noting details that spoke of patience and skill far beyond what she had imagined from a warrior chief. The horse's mane flowed in realistic waves, its eyes held depths that suggested intelligence, and its stance conveyed both strength and gentleness. A strange gift from a war leader, she observed quietly. Perhaps that's the point, Hakon replied. to show us that he values things beyond warfare, or to demonstrate that he has access to luxuries that come from successful conquest, Bjorn added skeptically. Beautiful objects can be spoils as easily as they can be products of peaceful trade. The observation highlighted the central challenge of their mission. Every piece of evidence they encountered could be interpreted in multiple ways. The question was whether they would be skilled enough to distinguish truth from careful presentation. As the morning progressed, final preparations occupied everyone's attention. Weapons were checked and secured, though they would carry minimal arms to avoid appearing threatening. Supplies were packed with careful consideration of what the journey might require. Messages were prepared for families in case the mission proved more dangerous than anticipated. But for Freya, the most difficult preparation was emotional. Standing in the stable for what might be the last time, feeding grain to horses that had become her companions and confidants, she felt the weight of leaving everything familiar for an uncertain future. Stormwind nuzzled her shoulder as if sensing her mood, his great head warm and reassuring against her neck. "Take care of yourself, old friend," she whispered, "and take care of your master when he returns." "Planning to abandon us already?" Hakon's voice came from behind her, gentle but touched with something that might have been concern. "Planning to hope we all return safely," she corrected, turning to face him. "But understanding that hope and certainty are different things." He moved closer, his presence filling the small space between the stalls. "Whatever we find in Ragnar's settlement, whatever decision we make based on what we learn, I want you to know that these past weeks have changed something fundamental for me. The conflict has changed many things for all of us. Not the conflict," he said quietly. "You, the way you see patterns that others miss, the way you find strength in gentleness, the way you've made me question everything I thought I knew about what it means to be strong." The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. She had felt the change he spoke of, had sensed the growing connection that made her care about his safety more than her own. But acknowledging such feelings openly carried risks that went far beyond personal disappointment. "Hakon, I know the dangers," he said before she could voice her concerns. "I know what others would say, what consequences might follow, but I also know that some truths are worth the risks they create." The bone chess piece in her pack seemed to pulse with significance as she considered his words. Tomorrow they would leave together for an unknown destination, carrying hopes and fears that could reshape their world. Whether they returned as the same people who departed remained to be seen. The golden anchor chain stretched from the ship's rail into crystal-clear water that revealed ancient stone foundations far below the surface. They had arrived at Ragnar's settlement to find not the rough war camp they had expected, but something that challenged every assumption they had brought with them. The harbor was built into a natural cove, but the construction was unlike anything in the northern lands. Stone piers extended into deep water, allowing the largest ships to dock safely. Warehouses lined the waterfront, their walls decorated with carvings that depicted not battles and conquest, but scenes of trade, craftsmanship, and peaceful cooperation. Gardens terraced up the hillsides, green with crops that spoke of careful cultivation and long-term planning. This took years to build, Bjorn whispered as their escort ship glided toward the main dock. "Decades, perhaps. This isn't some temporary raiding base. It's a permanent settlement designed to last." Freya stood at the ship's rail, studying the carved anchor chain that had drawn her attention. Each link was decorated with symbols that spoke of different crafts and trades. Hammers for smithwork, sheaves for farming, looms for weaving, ships for maritime commerce. It was functional art that celebrated creation over destruction. There, Hakon pointed toward a group of figures waiting on the main pier. Gunnar Ironfist. Even at a distance, the Jarl's brother was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the same aggressive bearing that had made him legendary in Skarnvik. But as their ship drew closer, subtle differences became apparent. His clothing was finer than what he had worn as a raider, his weapons more ornate, and his posture suggested confidence rather than the constant alertness of a warrior in hostile territory. Beside him stood Astrid Eriksdottir, no longer disguised as she had been at the Standing Stones. In daylight, wearing the rich garments appropriate to her station, she looked every inch the high-born lady she had been before her apparent death and transformation. But her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences that had fundamentally changed her understanding of the world. "Welcome to Ravensholm," Gunnar called as they disembarked. His voice carried genuine warmth, without the forced heartiness that often masked political calculations. Eric the Stern chose his delegation well. The reunion between Gunnar and Bjorn was emotional. Two warriors who had believed each other dead or enslaved, embracing like brothers, returned from the grave. But it was Astrid's greeting that surprised Freya most. "You must be the artist," she said, approaching with a small wrapped package in her hands. "The one who carved the horse that has become something of a symbol in our discussions." Freya accepted the package uncertainly, unwrapping it to reveal her own wooden carving, but transformed. Someone had inlaid the simple pine with silver wire that traced the horse's mane and outlined its features. The grain bowl was there too, likewise enhanced with precious metal that turned practical craftsmanship into genuine art. "How did you—" she began. The merchant who brought them to our attention described their creator as someone who understood that true strength serves life rather than death, Astrid explained. Ragnar was so impressed by that description that he commissioned our finest craftsmen to honor your work while preserving its essential spirit. The transformed carvings felt warm in Freya's hands, their familiar shapes made precious by the respect they represented. But more than the silver inlay, she was struck by the care taken to preserve the original form she had created. This was enhancement rather than replacement, recognition of value rather than correction of inadequacy. "Come," Gunnar said, gesturing toward the town that spread beyond the harbor. "Let us show you what we've built here, and you can judge for yourselves whether our promises align with reality." The tour that followed challenged every expectation they had brought to the meeting. Streets were paved with stone and lined with workshops where craftsmen pursued trades that complemented rather than competed with each other. Children played safely in open spaces while their parents worked without the constant fear of raids that shadowed life in traditional settlements. Most remarkably, former enemies worked side by side. Saxon craftsmen who had once defended their monasteries against Norse raiders now taught their skills to willing students. Irish scholars shared their knowledge of writing and mathematics with warriors who had once burned their libraries. The integration wasn't perfect. Tensions remained visible beneath the obvious surface cooperation, but the effort was genuine. "This is what Ragnar means by sustainable prosperity," Astrid explained as they walked through a market where goods from across the known world changed hands peacefully. Not the quick wealth of successful raids, but the steady accumulation that comes from creating value rather than simply taking it from others. But it was their final stop that provided the most powerful argument for Ragnar's vision. In a workshop near the town's center, they found the man himself, not holding court like a traditional war chief, but working alongside a master smith to create tools for farming rather than weapons for battle. Ragnar the Black was younger than they had expected, perhaps 35 winters, with the lean build of a man who had earned his reputation through skill rather than mere size. When he looked up from his work, his eyes held intelligence that spoke of someone who had thought deeply about the implications of the life he was building. The woven grass rope lay coiled beside the grain bowl like a promise kept across impossible distances. 6 months had passed since the delegation's return from Ravensholm. 6 months since Skarnvik had chosen alliance over isolation, cooperation over conquest. The rope had arrived that morning with the first trade ship of the spring season, woven by children in Ragnar's settlement from grass, that grew in the meadows, where former enemies now tended sheep together. Freya ran her fingers along the rope's smooth surface, marveling at the skill that had transformed simple materials into something both beautiful and useful. Each strand had been carefully prepared and twisted with others to create strength that no single piece could achieve alone. It was an apt metaphor for everything that had changed since their return from the south. The transformation of Skarnvik had not been without challenges. When King Ivar's fleet had finally appeared on the northern horizon, 15 ships strong and hungry for conquest, they had found not an isolated village ripe for plundering, but a settlement protected by Ragnar's network of allies. The battle that followed had been brief and decisive, with trade ships converting to war vessels and coordinated tactics overwhelming Ivar's traditional raiding approach. More difficult had been the internal changes required by their new alliance. Warriors accustomed to measuring worth by raids completed had to learn new ways of demonstrating valor. Craftsmen who had worked primarily to support military expeditions discovered markets for their skills that extended far beyond weapon-making. Children began learning to read and write alongside traditional skills of seamanship and combat. But perhaps the most profound change had been in the relationship between Freya and Hakon. What had begun as chance meetings in a stable had evolved into a partnership that challenged every social convention while creating something entirely new. "The rope is beautiful," Hakon said, settling beside her in what had once been the village's armory, but was now a workshop where she taught others the carving skills that had helped transform their world. "Though I suspect it carries meanings beyond its practical purpose. A reminder that strength comes from connection rather than isolation," she replied, holding up a section where different colored strands wove together in complex patterns. Each piece supports the others while maintaining its own character. He smiled at her interpretation, the expression transforming his scarred features in ways that still surprised her. The fierce warrior who had terrorized enemies across the northern seas had discovered reserves of gentleness that made him more formidable than any amount of battle rage ever could. Children who once fled from his presence now sought him out for stories and guidance, drawn by a strength that protected rather than threatened. "Eric wants to discuss expanding the workshops," he said, gesturing toward the various projects that filled the converted space. "Demand for our carved work has grown beyond what we can supply from Skarnvik alone." "Good problems to have," she observed, setting aside a piece she had been working on, a chess set commissioned by a merchant from Byzantium, each piece carved to represent different aspects of the new alliance. Though success brings its own challenges. Such as ensuring that prosperity doesn't corrupt the values that made it possible in the first place. She looked around the workshop where former thralls worked beside freed warriors, their different backgrounds creating innovations that neither could have achieved alone. It would be easy to become what we once were, just with better resources. The observation touched something they had all been grappling with as their situation improved. Wealth was accumulating in Skarnvik at rates that would have been impossible under the old raiding system. Trade relationships were generating steady income while also providing access to goods and knowledge from across the known world. But with success came temptations to abandon the cooperative principles that had made such success possible. "That's why we need voices like yours in the council meetings," Hakon said seriously. "People who remember what it felt like to have nothing, who understand the difference between strength that protects and strength that dominates." The transition to including former thralls in village governance had been among the most controversial changes. Many warriors still struggled with the idea that practical wisdom could be as valuable as martial prowess. But the success of their new approach was gradually winning over even the most traditionalist voices. "Astrid's latest message mentioned something interesting," Hakon continued, pulling a rolled parchment from his belt. "She wants to establish a gathering of allied settlements, an annual meeting where representatives can share innovations, resolve disputes, and coordinate responses to common threats. Freya considered the implications as she examined the message. Astrid's handwriting was careful and precise, each word chosen for maximum clarity. The proposal outlined a structure for cooperation that went far beyond simple trade agreements, creating something that resembled a confederation of independent communities united by shared values. "And she wants Skarnvik to host the first gathering," she noted, reading between the lines of formal language to the personal warmth that characterized Astrid's communications. "She specifically requested that you lead the discussions about integrating different community structures," Hakon added with barely concealed pride. "Your insights about how to preserve individual strengths while building collective power have become legendary among the Alliance settlements." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. To help shape the future development of communities across the northern seas, to have her voice heard in discussions that would affect thousands of lives, was beyond anything she could have imagined during those first quiet evenings in the stable. "The girl who fed horses while the town feasted," she murmured, remembering how this all began. "The woman who helped us understand that the greatest feasts are those where everyone has enough to eat," Hakon corrected gently. The woven rope lay between them like a bridge connecting past and future, its intertwined strands catching the afternoon light that streamed through windows that had once been arrow slits. Outside, children played games that combined traditions from multiple cultures, while their parents worked together on projects that would have been impossible without cooperation between former enemies. It was not the ending any of them could have predicted, but it was the beginning they had all been searching for without knowing what they sought. In the distance, ships flew flags that represented not conquest, but commerce, carrying goods and knowledge that enriched everyone they touched. The stable behind the smithy still housed horses, but now they pulled carts loaded with trade goods rather than warriors heading for raid. And in the workshop, where a thrall had once hidden her small acts of kindness, the future was being carved one careful stroke at a time.